Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. Thank you for joining us today for this IASC briefing on system-wide efforts to prevent famine and address growing risks of food insecurity. My name is Mervat Shilbaya, and I am the head of the IASC Secretariat, and I'm extremely pleased to also have the opportunity today to facilitate today's discussion. So, colleagues, we're going to get started. I can see that our panelists are online. I think we're missing, if I'm not mistaken, Dominique will be joining us oh, there we go. I see you, Dominique. So I see Dominique, Martin, Jane, and Giancarlo. Welcome. I'm glad that you are able to join, and I hope you can hear me loud and clear. We're going to get started, and thanks so much for turning on also your cameras. So colleagues, acute hunger projections for 2021 are extremely alarming. According to estimates by the World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization, 155 million people across 55 countries are experiencing crisis levels of food insecurity. This includes around 500,000 people having already reached catastrophic levels of food insecurity and are on the brink of starvation. It also includes more than 34 million people facing emergency levels of acute food insecurity. Yemen, South Sudan, Northeast Nigeria, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso are reportedly at immediate risk of famine, while Madagascar, Sud, Afghanistan, DRC, Haiti, Sudan, and Syria have seen significant increases in acute levels of food insecurity. So without urgent action, vulnerable people in these countries risk falling into famine or famine-like conditions. And it is against this backdrop that we are gathered today to discuss this issue, including what's been done to date, including by the Interagency Standing Committee organizations, as well as partners, including development partners, to avert this imminent risk of famine and increased levels of food insecurity in many of the countries that I've mentioned. It is also a really good opportunity for us to discuss what more should and can be done to support such efforts. I am extremely pleased that we are joined today by a distinguished panel to speak to us on this issue. So first, welcome to Dominique Bourgeon, who is the director of FAO's Liaison Office in Geneva. Welcome, Dominique. Dominique has over 25 years of experience in humanitarian and development assistance, including in various leadership positions with FAO, including most recently as director of the Emergency and Rehabilitation Division in Rome, as well as FAO's representative in Bangladesh. Welcome again, Dominique, and I'm glad you could join us today. I'm also extremely pleased that we're joined by Dr. Martin van Nukup, who is the Global Director for the Agriculture and Food Global Practice with the World Bank. In this role, Martin oversees the operationalization of the bank's vision on agriculture and food in regional and country programs, which has a portfolio of projects worth close to $20 billion. Martin joined the World Bank in 1993 and served in several regions across the world. Thanks a lot, Martin, also for joining. Glad you could be with us today. We're also glad that we're joined by Ms. Jane Bachhorst, who is the chair of the board of the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, IGVA, and she's also senior advisor on humanitarian policy and advocacy with Christian Aid. Jane has extensive experience in humanitarian action, having worked at the Red Cross, the UN, ECHO, and NGOs in various positions, including senior ones in more than 30 countries. Previously, she was the head of the World Vision's Europe office, and she led several NGO coalitions working on various issues, including child protection, CivMil coordination, localization, and conflict prevention. Welcome, Jane. Thanks so much for joining. Last but definitely not least, I'm so glad that we're also joined by Giancarlo Chiri, who is the Deputy Director of the World Food Programme's Global Office in Geneva since August of last year. He has extensive experience with the World Food Programme at headquarters and in major operations, having served as a Deputy Director of Emergencies and WFP Country Director and Representative in a number of countries, including CAR, Yemen, Mauritania, and Niger. Also, previously, he served as Project Director with the IASC's peer-to-peer project between 2016 and 2018. And prior to joining the World Food Programme, he worked for ICRC in Kenya, Somalia, Bosnia, and Yemen. Welcome again, Giancarlo, and welcome to all of our panelists. And I'm glad that you can join us today for this important discussion. Colleagues online, as with usual practice, we will kickstart first by hearing from our panelists. And we welcome you that also during the interventions from the panelists, please feel free to post your questions or your comments or your feedback in the chat box. And we'll make sure myself and Ali and colleagues from the IASC Secretariat to direct the questions as they come in to our panelists after their initial interventions. So without further ado, perhaps I could turn first to Dominique. Dominique, again, with the Food and Agricultural Organization. Dominique, with growing concerns regarding the increased risk of food insecurity and also the Secretary General's recent decision to establish a high-level task force to avert the risk of famine, can you perhaps spend a few minutes just to provide us with an overview of the risks of famine in humanitarian settings and what are the factors that are contributing to such increased risks? Over to you, please, Dominique.
Well, thank you very much, Mervat, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this indeed very timely briefing today. As you have mentioned, Mervat, and you are all very well aware, we are currently facing an extremely serious global food security situation, and the reality is that it may only get worse in the months to come, especially as we move towards the lean seasons in many of the world's most vulnerable countries.
Dominique, apologies for interrupting you. Your voice is coming in and out, so it's not super clear. If there's a way to come closer to the mic, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me better like that?
Much better, much better. Thank you.
Okay, then, okay, because sometimes I'm told I'm too close to the screen, so no, okay. Okay, thank you, Mervat. So I was just saying that just 5 weeks ago, we issued the 2021 edition of the Global Report on Food Crisis. And as you mentioned, Mervat, it indicated that 155 million people worldwide in 2020 were experiencing crisis or worst level of acute food insecurity. Of this, already in 2020, 133,000 people in 3 countries, Burkina, South Sudan, and Yemen, were in IPC 5 or catastrophic level of acute food insecurity. And here, just to be clear, when we talk about acute food insecurity, we are talking about hunger that is driven by shocks and disaster and that require urgent humanitarian assistance. This is the type of hunger that is the most severe, that threatens lives and risk to slide, of course, into famine if urgent action is not taken. Yet, I think it's also important to know that, unfortunately, chronic food insecurity is also going up, as we will be documenting in the soon-to-be-released State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World. I also wish to clarify that, when we are talking of acute food insecurity, we are referring to the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or the Cadre Harmonisé in West Africa. And I wish to clarify that this is not an FAO initiative. Indeed, while FAO hosts the IPC Global Support Unit, the IPC is actually a multi-partner initiative involving 15 partners at global level that is working towards consensus building. And that has been for the last 10 or 15 years the global standard for classification of acute food insecurity. It is therefore the primary source of information for classification of acute insecurity in about 45 countries. I was referring to the IPC, which is composed of 5 phases. Phase 5 being also being the most extreme, the catastrophe or famine situation. Here I also think it's also an opportunity to clarify that famine is a classification of IPC phase 5 at area level. It means that in a given area, famine occurs when 3 criteria are met simultaneously. When 20% of the population is experiencing severe food shortage, when 1 out of 3 children are acutely malnourished, and when there is a doubling of the mortality at 2 persons per day per 10,000 inhabitants. This said, and this is the situation we are experiencing right now, households may be classified in IPC 5, even if the area is not itself classified in famine. And this is the case when less than 20% of the population of the given area is experiencing famine condition. Globally, we may not yet in 2021 have any official declaration of famine based on the IPC standard, but it's clear, as you said, Mervat, that the situation is truly disturbing and very, very serious. A lot of political and media attention has been put on the number of people facing famine-like condition. This is indeed well deserved, as in 6 months into 2021, as you were saying, the number of people in IPC 5 has risen 4-fold to reach 522,000 in 4 countries, Ethiopia, Madagascar, South Sudan, and Yemen. But equally concerning and require our immediate attention are the 34 million people estimated to be experiencing IPC 4, which is the emergency phase and which is 1 step away from the catastrophe. And here again, it's important to keep in mind that when we are talking of IPC 4, this is where families are already experiencing large food consumption gaps and where there is already excess mortality and where there is complete depletion beyond recovery of livelihood assets. And it's clear that today the focus has been on the countries that you and I have mentioned, Mervat, but there are also other countries that receive less attention and where the situation is equally worrying. And we are talking, for example, of the DRC, the largest food crisis in the world today in terms of number of people, or Afghanistan, the 3rd largest crisis after Yemen, or even Central African Republic, where the number might not be as high, but where the percentage is very high, with about 50% of the population in acute food insecurity. In terms of the drivers, of course, conflict remains the main one. About 97 out of the 155 million people last year in acute food insecurity were living in situation where conflict is a main driver. And you know the impact of conflict in terms of people not being able to farm or not having access to good quality farming or not access to food. Climate extreme is another important driver. And in last year, of course, we had the secondary impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So before concluding, let me just say, Mervat, that for the humanitarian community, as we cope with high and rising needs, there are 2 main priorities to avert a further slide. First, funds. We need resources and we need them fast if we are to prevent a worst case situation. This is especially true for agriculture in view of the seasonality of the activities, and we need these resources to be flexible, unearmarked, and front-loaded. Since late last year, FAO and WFP and OCHA have been warning on this anticipated deterioration, and as you mentioned, in March, the UN Secretary General launched the high-level task force. The same month, we also issued together with WFP the hunger hotspot, which clearly identified ongoing and likely deterioration in 20 countries. We are running out of time. Planting seasons are being missed, livestock are being sold off in desperation, and humanitarian food needs are rising fast. Second, we need safe, sustained access to people in need. Civilian population must be able to safely access life-saving assistance, particularly in situation of widespread deterioration and wide-scale insecurity. Finally, it is more important than ever that we also act together to address the root causes of these rising levels of acute food insecurity and prevent their deterioration to famine. Indeed, we do not only want to avoid a famine to be declared, to be formally declared, big famine to be declared in 2021, but we also want to avoid to find ourselves having to do it again next year. So this cycle must be ended, and this would require a clear shift in an increased collaboration among humanitarian development and peace actors. And this is something I guess my fellow panelists will be willing to elaborate as we move in this discussion. Thank you, Merva.
Many thanks, Dominique, and thanks first also for clarifying the IPC mechanism, and again, and highlighting that it is indeed this global standard for classification of food insecurity. And it is again a mechanism that is well established. It has been around for over a decade or a decade and a half now, and it's done in partnership with 15 different partners. So that's really, really important because, of course, as humanitarian actors and as different stakeholders also represented online, we rely quite heavily on the IPC. So it's really important to understand the background and how well established and this mechanism is. I hear you also loud and clear, and I think this is an important piece of information with regards to what is the criteria that is required, the 3 criteria that you identified, including severe food shortages, doubling in mortality rates, and so on before famine is declared. But having said that, again, there are areas, it doesn't have to be the whole country, but areas that have arrived at IPC 5 that are experiencing famine or famine-like conditions, and it's important to be aware of that before an actual declaration is announced or launched. Also hear you loud and clear that around the 4-fold increase in the number of vulnerable people that have arrived at the IPC 5 level only in 4 countries. And this is just over the course of the past 6 months, which is extremely concerning. But also your message that we, in addition to IPC 5 concerns, we should also be equally concerned for populations. I believe it's 34 million people, if I'm not mistaken, that are under IPC 4, which is also acute food insecurity levels. And there is a lot that needs to be done to ensure that these communities and these populations do not, their situation does not deteriorate further to arrive at the IPC 5 levels. So I hear you that in addition to the countries that you've mentioned, there are a number of other countries that require the same level of attention, including DRC, CAR, Afghanistan, and others. I think your message is also so clear in terms of the need for funds, quality and flexible funding as a matter of urgency, of priority, and also the issue around access, unhindered and unfettered humanitarian access, so that we can work with local actors and local communities and local authorities to make sure that we're able to support as needed to avert this risk of further deterioration in food insecurity. So I had a different sequence in terms of asking questions, but as you speak about funding and access, I'm tempted to actually turn to you, Jane, if it's okay. Jane, again, is the chair of the IGVA board and also with Christian Aid. So Jane, I know that the NGO community is playing an important role to advocate for funding as well as unhindered humanitarian access to respond to the needs of communities in hard-to-reach areas, especially to address the food insecurity challenges that we're speaking about. Can you speak to NGO efforts in that regard, and what more needs to be done to strengthen joined-up work and collaboration across the IASC and with partners? Over to you, please, Jane.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mervat. And I suppose we were thinking as a community of NGOs over the course of the last week in preparation for this briefing about a series of questions that we need to be asking as the Interagency Standing Committee community, more broadly as the humanitarian sector, but also in relation to a number of initiatives that are ongoing now and in results, flowing from, in the lead up to and flowing from the G7. And I suppose the first question is, what can we do to support each other better in the Interagency Standing Committee? How can we voice our concerns consistently, robustly, and collectively at the right times and in the right ways? How is the high level together? Can we improve how we engage the Interagency Standing Committee as a whole in the high level panel's work? Of our organisations are talking about increasing the diversity of views and opinions, and for example, local and national NGOs and of women-led organisations within that. Secondly, we just feel that we need to get back to a sense of injecting urgency. Our organisations have had to pivot, adjust to a COVID-19 response, but at the same time, we've been battling with conflict, we've been battling with climate change and adaptation, and a number of different contexts. Can we envisage acting once we are at IPC3 level? Given that, especially now, behind closed doors, some donors are admitting that we have already failed as a system. Since the open letter organised by ICVA and other global networks in April, there have been an additional 5 million people who have gone into IPC4. So where is our public outrage as civil society, as NGOs, and as the Interagency Standing Committee about this? The kind of outrage that we have seen in the past. We're doing our best as Interagency Standing Committee members, but can we help society at large and the humanitarian system at large to get back to that sense of urgency, to become more consistent, more robust, and actually amplify our own voices around what we are seeing, what we've been just hearing from about. Did we need to envisage continuing with the concept of a panel at the G7? Do we feel that the G7 statement, the compact, takes this adequately? And how do we concretely make the compact work for national and local organisations and communities and community-based organisations driving forward this work, often behind the scenes? Also, the UN Security Council needs to act before starvation is used prima facie as a weapon of war and/or an investigation is completed. We know in the case of South Sudan, it's great the investigation concluded that, but wasn't that too late? Should we be appealing now for the 24/17 tools we put into play now for Ethiopia? On South Sudan, it's nearing its worst famine since independence in 2011. We've seen unprecedented floods becoming precedented and a disproportionate impact on women and girls. So we were thinking, should our focus concretely be on, firstly, a robust, collective, consistent advocacy once a threshold has been passed? And we're suggesting IPC3 in line with what our colleague has just said, especially when it cuts across a significant geographic and population level, and really bringing in not only the voice, but the presence of local and national NGOs into our discussions, and including that of the high-level panel, Secondly, appealing to G7 members to take immediate steps to disperse the compact's funding pledges and working together to rally increased support from all other states, especially members of the G20 and the G77, to meet the scale of this crisis. What action can we take collectively if follow-up to this is too slow? Can we envisage, for example, doing this even within the next month? We will need as NGOs clarity on funding allocations, especially to NGOs, and more funding in the coming months. We believe the G7 commitment was really just the start, and we need to think next missed planting season, a potential mixed harvest, next cyclone, next locust infestation, and invest now in preparedness and climate adaptation and resilience. Also, thirdly, ensuring that we take forward in a practical manner agreements across the Interagency Standing Committee and beyond on, for example, flexible funding, quality funding, and expediting funding to frontline organisations, as we developed, for example, during the COVID-19 response. I mean, how can those agreements and that thinking, that good thinking there, apply to what we're now talking about here today? This also means, for example, that country-based pool funds are adjusted, for example, mono-sector grants are funded. In the case of South Sudan, many South Sudan NGOs felt that there had been a preference for multi-sector grants led by international NGOs and were the preference of international NGOs, whereas their mono-sector grants which were more easily managed by them, didn't necessarily get funded. In Ethiopia, we are actually seeing women-led community-based organisations reaching unreached populations or inaccessible population. And this needs to be supported and amplified while broader access is facilitated by parties to the conflict and those in effective control to ensure a diversity of actors and the full strength of the humanitarian system comes behind those populations, for example, in Tigray, and responds to dire IPC5 conditions in several locations. And as colleagues have said today, what can we really do to ensure we are anticipating? Can we provide, how do we provide the right resources early on? We have now tested tools and a number of initiatives. How can these be scaled up? How can the World Bank's Anticipatory Action Emergency Fund window, for example, be employed to support frontline responders? And then on access, this is closely entwined with security, inclusion, and accountability in many of the contexts where our member organizations are endeavoring to scale up. In Ethiopia, the appeal from the UN Secretary General last week is heard and of relevance to Ethiopia, South Sudan, and other contexts. We need close dialogue between CivMil, OCHA CivMil, and ICRC operational communities, for example, communicators, for example, local and national NGOs and their communities, with consistent support, backup, and messaging from diplomats and those in authority. And we'd really need a heightened understanding of the need for humanitarian communication with relevant actors, an area that the Interagency Standing Committee Working Group on Counterterrorism is working on now. As we knew before the World Humanitarian Summit, in the tsunami evaluation, which led to system reforms in 2005, and as we have seen confirmed during the COVID-19 response, it really is frontline NGOs who are shouldering most of the risk and delivery. Quality funding and flexibility really needs to be cascaded to them. Funds need to be expedited and risk needs to be shared. This really speaks to the relevance of listening to communities and supporting their leadership of humanitarian response in line with the core humanitarian standard. For this, we really need to ensure that the grand bargain reforms being discussed today are fit for purpose and are really implemented quickly in the potentially 2-year timeframe that remains to us. Those are just some thoughts. Mervat, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Many, many thanks, Jane. You've covered quite a large area, a number of issues. But again, perhaps just to underscore the points around the need for engaging more closely with local actors. Thanks so much for highlighting this. We speak a lot about localization. Here's yet another opportunity to engage more systematically and ensure meaningful engagement with local actors. Thanks also for putting the spotlight on the critical work that was done in response to the COVID-19 in the earlier phases of the response last year, when more efforts were put in place to make sure that funds at scale were expedited in terms of being channeled to frontline responders, both international but also local NGOs. And I hear you that this needs to be systematic and an established way of conducting business and conducting our work. And I hear you also absolutely on the critical role that donors play, along also with UN partners around quality funding, flexible funding, and flexible measures to make sure that we're able to respond quickly on the ground. And again, as pointed out, working with frontline responders. The issue around advocacy is also key. And I hear you also around the need for strong, coordinated advocacy and robust advocacy, not when we reach the IPC4 and IPC5 levels, but also earlier on around IPC3. And to that, will turn to Martin with the World Bank shortly, because I know that there is some really good and important work being done there. And there's a lot to do jointly with development actors, including on anticipatory financing and anticipatory action to address and avert the risks that we're currently facing vis-a-vis famine. So maybe with that, I'd like to actually turn to Martin. And so it would be great, Martin, if it's possible, in addition to giving us a visual of what the World Bank is doing to address this increased risk of food insecurity and famine, what more needs to be done, and what are these efforts to complement ongoing work by the humanitarian community and the IASC, and any thoughts or recommendations on what more needs to be done to address the long-term drivers of hunger would also be greatly appreciated. So again, a visual of what the World Bank is doing and how are these efforts complementing ongoing work and efforts by the IASC and the humanitarian community, and any thoughts or recommendation on what more needs to be done to address the long-term drivers of hunger would be really, really appreciated. I know it's a loaded set of questions, but over to you, please, Martin, before we go to Giancarlo.
Thank you very much, Mavat. And of course, a short answer to your question is that a hell of a lot needs to be done more on this very important agenda. And just to start off by saying that, food and nutrition insecurity is very high on the agenda of bank senior management and the board. Actually, the executive directors of the board have asked me to provide a briefing to them on food and nutrition insecurity. Actually, that will take place on Friday. Also, last week, Monday, June 7th, David Beasley, the executive director of the World Food Programme, actually addressed the board. So just as an indication, this is very high on the agenda. I'd like to start, Mervat, if it's okay, to provide a few reflections, the bigger picture on food and nutrition insecurity, and let me start by saying that in our view, this is a manifestation of a food system that has many hidden costs and is broken and is not fit for purpose. We have a food system under which 2 billion people are under and malnourished. 2 billion people are overweight and obese. 1/3 of agriculture production is lost and wasted. The sector, represents about 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's the biggest driver of biodiversity loss to land use change. You can go on. And if you put actually price on that, and estimate and put a dollar figure on the hidden cost, the estimate is that this is about $12 trillion per year. FAO report that came out at the UN Climate Action Summit in September 2019. The market value of the global food system is about $10 trillion. So it actually shows the magnitude of which the global food system is broken. Now on food security, also, this is if you look at the trends, food insecurity started increasing in 2015. This coincided, with the adoption of the SDGs. SDG 2 was adopted in 2015 at the same time that the trend actually started moving away from achieving that target. And of course, it took COVID-19 about 5 years into the 15 period, to achieve SDG 2 as a wake-up call and to actually kind of get more attention to this very sobering and pressing problem. Also, food insecurity is a persistent problem. No? If you look at some recent papers and analytics on this, the biggest predictor of food crisis, IPC 3+, is the prior state of food security. This is a bigger explanation than climate change, economic stress, and conflict. Although climate and this prior state actually are very close, but prior state is slightly a bigger explanation. And of course, also, as already reflected by the previous speaker, if that's the biggest predictor, the implication is that governments in the international community, tend to swing into action when it is actually very late or too late. And also to follow up what Dominique was saying, this is not because of lack of predictive capabilities. Actually, we are in very good positions, FuseNet and other mechanisms, actually to predict what's going to happen, 12, 15 months, down the road. And of course, another important reflection on food insecurity, Mavat, is that COVID-19, of course, made food insecurity and nutrition insecurity a lot worse. At the same time, we should not be surprised by the outbreak of this pandemic. It was always a matter of when rather than of if a next pandemic would happen. And of course, if you look at the pandemics that happened over the last 20 to 30 years, the vast majority are of zoonotic nature. And of course, zoonotic risks, increase when natural habitats are being destroyed. And of course, we know that agriculture is the biggest driver of natural habitat destruction. Also, poor functioning wet markets, are major transmission point of zoonotic risks. So in a way, the rise in food insecurity and nutrition insecurity that we see associated with COVID-19, it's the food system itself, that's associated with the root cause of the pandemic that we're experiencing now. So that goes back to my first point. We are discussing food insecurity in the context of a global food system that is not fit for purpose. What is the bank doing? Of course, we're scaling up our short-term engagements. I mean, we have a big portfolio of social protection and social safety programs that are being scaled up. So this actually kind of reflects the affordability dimension of food insecurity. We're also working on the food availability dimension by making sure that trade flows stay open and food flows. I mean, that didn't happen, at the food price crisis in 2007, 2008, and that explained about 30% of the food price increase that we saw at that time. We also are financing next season production, et cetera, et cetera. A very important instrument that was mentioned earlier is the early response financing mechanism that came effective July 2019 with July 2020 that became effective with IDA 19. This is a fund of about $1 billion to address early on food and health emergencies. In this 1 year, about 13 countries across 5 regions have pursued support from the ERF, representing an expected $650 million in financing. 8 of the 11 countries identified as being of heightened risk of famine, have pursued support from the ERF. I mean, the 11 countries that are being discussed today. So this complements, of course, World Food Programs and other agencies, NGOs efforts, focusing on IPC3 plus. This ERF is actually focusing on the early stages, and I think that's kind of a nice complement that is actually needed to bring financing more upstream. The World Food Program and FAO are working very closely with the World Bank. An example is a major food security project that was recently approved for Yemen, the Yemen Food Security Response and Resilience Project, $127 million with grants provided to FAO, UNDP, and the World Food Program to execute that that project. Over time, if you look at the bank's financing for food and nutrition security, reflecting our programs in agriculture and food social protection, as well as on the private sector side, what IFC is doing on agribusiness and making that more inclusive, you see actually a vast increase from about $4 billion per year around the time of the food price crisis, to about $14 billion per year over the fiscal year 18 to 20, and a further increase projected, to about $17 billion per year of the current fiscal year and the next fiscal year. So clearly, the bank is scaling up its engagement on this agenda significantly. Also, to go back to the ERF, the early response financing, one condition, to access those funds is that countries will prepare food security crisis preparedness plans. And I think we see this really as an opportunity for development and humanitarian partners, to come together and work with those countries to provide a well-coordinated whole of aid approach, to address future food security crises. So I'm putting that out there, Merval. Now, the question, of course, is, if the bank's, funding has already gone up significantly to address food and nutrition security, and we're still confronted, with rising food insecurity levels, what's happening here? And that, of course, means, that we need to go back into my first point. That we're operating in the context of a food system that's broken. So we need to address, the fundamental drivers that actually lead to those significant hidden costs. And those drivers are climate change, conflict, economic stress, and of course, misguided policies and public support programs to agriculture. So in view of that, taking more the long-term view, the bank is scaling up its engagement on climate smart agriculture, nature-based solutions, nature positive agriculture, whatever label you want to put on it, as well as early warning systems. We see how climate co-benefits, have increased significantly, now reaching about 60% of portfolio. The new climate change action plan that our board is going to adopt this week on Thursday will further raise, the bank's climate ambitions. Also, talking about, we need more resources. A reflection on that is also that public support, to agriculture and the food system worldwide, based on the countries for we have data, is about $700 billion per year. This is a massive amount of public support that is being provided, despite the fact resulting in a food system that's not fit for purpose. So we think that those resources can be used much better by helping countries actually repurposing those public support programs, to provide and lead to better, environmental, sustainable, and climate outcomes, as well as to better food security and nutritional outcome. Of course, there's a big political economy dimension related to that repurposing agenda. And in that respect, I was quite pleased to see, and of course, you always want to see more by the G7 communique, actually, that in the context of climate change, actually put forward, the food system as a priority sector for transition, and actually committed G7 countries actually to put in place policies actually that support sustainability, nature-based solutions, etc. A third point I want to highlight, Mervat, is of course the importance of One Health. To reduce, prevent, or at least reduce, the threat and the risk of future pandemics. This is the ultimate global public good, a major agenda, also very good. And the bank is actually scaling up its engagement on this agenda significantly, also as part of our COVID-19 health response. But of course, much more needs to be done there. And also in that context, it's good to see that the G7 communique actually mentioned One Health specifically. And final point is, a lot of the increase in food insecurity and nutrition insecurity that we see, of course, is happening in fragile, conflict, and vulnerable states. So how can we get a better handle on operating in those type of environments by actually putting in place, interventions that support inclusive growth, as well as better natural resource management, because conflicts or tensions about natural resources, are an important source of conflict. So that's another area that we're looking at very closely. So that's from my side. Back to you. In a nutshell, this is a urgent, massive agenda. That needs massive kind of scale up attention and support moving forward. To kind of change the trend. Because right now we're moving away from SDG2, so the trend needs to be changed, and then we need to accelerate progress to achieving SDG2 by 2030. But we will know, this will be a bumpy road because of climate and the other long-term drivers requiring additional resources beyond what's already happening. So with that, back to you, Metta.
Super helpful, Martin, and thanks also for putting things also in perspective in terms of the bigger picture. And again, striking to look at food security or food insecurity in the context of a global food system that, as you refer to, is a system that is broken, and also sobering to hear of the $3 trillion per year of hidden costs associated with, again, this broken system. So quite sobering. But thanks also, Martin, for highlighting already some of the good examples of collaboration, including with the World Food Program. Great to hear that the executive director of the World Food Program was addressing the World Bank's board last week. Also really good to hear, learn more about the early response financing mechanism that was established last year, and opportunities again for engaging with the World Bank, including, again, as you highlight, that specific criteria to benefit from the early response financing mechanism is for food security crisis preparedness plans to be in place, so to be developed. So that is indeed an opportunity for the humanitarian community and organizations on the ground to engage with governments to contribute to that and make sure that we're collaborating on the ground where the rubber really hits the road to make sure that we do more, especially on the preparedness side, because I know this is one area that we're always keen to do more in. It's not an area that is easily funded, but here's an opportunity, especially in terms of engaging with the World Bank, where we can do a lot more jointly. So I think, with that, I mean, we had the chance, of course, to hear from Dominique on the overall picture, and also an explanation of the IPC and how it is used and when famine is declared and the criteria for declaring a famine or not. We had the chance to hear from Jane around advocacy efforts and the need to engage more with local actors. Martin, again, that critical view of the bigger picture around how food security or insecurity links to the global food system is really also quite sobering. So I want to bring it now back again to the IASC family, if I can say so, IASC family and partners, by turning to Giancarlo, who is Deputy Director of the World Food Program with the office here in Geneva, WFP Liaison office in Geneva. So Giancarlo, it would be really great to hear from you, if possible, what the IASC members are and partners are doing to step up efforts, to scale up efforts to avert the risk of famine. What are the efforts underway to concretely address this rising risk of famine? And again, we've heard the alarming figures that Dominique referred to. And it would be great, again, perhaps Giancarlo from your end, in addition to the funding issue, which Dominique already highlighted, what are the practical or concrete steps that need to be taken to strengthen the system's collective ability to address this crisis that we're facing at the moment? Over to you, please, Giancarlo.
Thank you, Mervat. A bit of a difficult task for a WFP person, but I'll try. But if I may, I would like to come back to what all the panelists have mentioned about the critical situation we are facing. I think, in fact, that we really need to realize, integrate, and understand that as a humanitarian community, we have rarely been faced with such a huge challenge. Now, I would not like to be perceived as preaching against my own chapel, but in this regard, food insecurity is most probably the tip of the iceberg. The affected people needs go, I'm afraid, well beyond food. Let me go to what the UN Secretary General said not long ago. But he said that we have to go back a long way in our contemporary history to find a comparable level of needs. Some people are going back to the end of the Second World War, and others are going back even to the 30s, to the Great Depression. So I think this is our first task. We need to realize that within the humanitarian community, of course, but also, and equally important, within the membership, we need to realize the critical moment in history we are facing. And many elements of the very dire situation have been depicted. We have not mentioned two. One is the price hikes, okay? This is something that will aggravate further the crisis we are facing. The second element we've not mentioned is the unbelievably high level or number of IDPs. And this in humanitarian action is a real important element. Most of the time, IDPs, they need an intersectoral response. So that makes the response even more costlier to cater to those needs. So what we need, I think, we need the international community to amplify our appeal to decision makers. And Jane referred to the G7 and the G20. Of course, that's a very important step. And to focus the global dialogue on the magnitude of the current humanitarian needs. Of course, and this has been said, you know, injecting a sense of urgency, we must act now. We need to use all available resources to prevent this impending loss of life. So as a system, I think, and this is what we do, we keep on appealing for every possible efforts to be made to mobilize additional and flexible resources and to advocate with donors, IFIs and government. And, you know, I have here a post-it that it's written, be positive. Well, it's very difficult, in fact, to be positive, because to the gloomy picture, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the humanitarian needs overview funding update, but if we extrapolate the data we have so far, I mean, what the humanitarian community will receive at the end of the year will be far less than what we received last year, and even less of the year before. So this is really, really of high concern. Now, without, you know, taking too long and trying to render justice to the interagency recent endeavor, I think we've been focusing on, you know, scaling up life-saving, firstly, food and nutrition assistance, but an intersectoral response to meet the essential needs of the affected people, and that was mentioned, but this is very important, overcoming access challenges and possibly expanding cash-based transfer. The list of countries of concern is so long that I won't, you know, and I think it's almost impossible to say what, you know, country is of the highest concern, because this is a moving target. We've seen recently with Tigray, we've seen recently with Madagascar, you know, coming to the picture quite recently. What we're doing as well is that I think we've developed a joint resource mobilization strategy to avert famine through coherent advocacy messaging. And this, I would like to take the opportunity to thank ICVA for the open letter, because this, I think, was key to trigger within member states, you know, a realization that, oh, something really special is now happening. And I can tell you, I have donors that called me after this appeal. So thanks a lot to ICVA. This is one of the elements of the messaging. A bit of a pitch for the SURF, okay? I think we are using as wisely as possible the SURF. The recent allocation from the Emergency Relief Coordinator, it was announced yesterday, okay, is really, really appreciated and providing some comfort, even though we have to acknowledge the fact that the amount remains rather small in regard to the ocean of needs we are facing. And in WFP, we have a kind of similar system. It's called the immediate response account that we are using, you know, at the maximum of its possibility to front load operations and provide funding to our field colleague. Then thirdly, I think we are focusing on operational humanitarian access, but we are, you know, trying at the same time building our skills and expertise to ensure we reach remote communities and staff is able to stay and deliver. And this is not a small endeavor. You know, in Afghanistan, the humanitarian community had to confirm that the intention of the humanitarian community, regardless of the deteriorating security conditions, is to stay, okay? as we've been saying for decades in Afghanistan. It's just an example. So these are a few elements. Of course, we have the high-level task force. This is not per se an interagency standing committee achievement, but this is helpful to lead and coordinate efforts by all means, and to support mobilization of needed resources. Within the Interagency Standing Committee, I think we have quite an active group, that is the Emergency Directors Group, that is really working hard to provide support to the many operations. The context and the many conflict situations we are facing really do require support from headquarters, and I think the EDG is playing there a very important role and part of it. To summarize, I think what we are doing is we're trying to first act at scale, to have this sense of urgency, to make sure that we are fast. We need to be fast, extremely fast. We need to maintain a certain level of quality and obviously relevance. The example to localization, just to mention one, the gender sensitive approach, etc. We have between 10 and 14 horizontal quality or thematics to ensure we are performing for those. So to conclude and to come back to my post-it note, to be positive, you know what, my feeling is that despite the difficulty of the situation, I think we can do it. Definitely we can do it. We've done that in the past, and we can do it. We need the resources, and we need to stay mobilized, all the interagency, all the humanitarian community, with the support in the short term of course, the member states and in particular the donor community. We need leadership, this is for sure, and the leadership of all constituencies, but it can be done. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thanks, Giancarlo, and thanks for ending on a positive note that indeed, I mean, we have no choice but to make sure that we do more and do better to make sure that we avoid the situation from deteriorating further, and to really be there for the people that we're all there to serve and support. So, but thanks for highlighting two additional components or elements that maybe have not been highlighted earlier around, again, the price hikes and also the special needs, I would say, or the specific needs of IDPs as well, and the importance of this integrated intersectoral response, you know, to make sure that we are coordinated in our effort to address this immediate risk, but also to address some of the root causes of the crisis that we're facing. I know that FAO, WFP, and OCHA are, of course, the critical members of the SG's high-level task force on the prevention of famine. And I understand that actually one of the key aspects is indeed around stepping up advocacy, stepping up efforts around resource mobilization. So thanks, Giancarlo, for highlighting the critical work around this joint resource mobilization, you know, strategy. Thanks for highlighting again the importance of staying and delivering, also in contexts where it is there are security challenges. And the importance of the community and humanitarian workers that are already on the ground to stay and deliver despite the challenges that are faced on the ground. And thanks also for highlighting the critical work that the Emergency Directors Group of the IASC is doing. And they are, again, charged with looking at the various situations, humanitarian context, and to make sure that we're mobilizing as a community to respond in as a coordinated fashion as possible. I saw a comment coming in from IRC with regards to indicating that they are estimating that additional numbers people are going hungry due to the economic consequences of COVID-19. So I understand, of course, that the figures that were presented are the figures at a point in time. But I understand, if I'm not mistaken, Dominique, and feel free to come in to speak about the report that will be launched shortly, that may give even a more alarming picture in terms of the number of people that are likely to suffer from further food insecurity or deterioration of the food insecurity levels as a result of the secondary impacts of COVID-19. But there are a number of other questions that have come in, and maybe, again, I know some of our colleagues online have directed questions to our panelists already, but I'll just to make sure that we have an equal distribution of responsibilities to respond to the questions. Maybe I'll direct perhaps the first question, if it's okay to you, Dominique, on IPC3. So if you can just perhaps, as you've done for explaining the criteria for IPC5 and the declaration of famine, if you can say a word on IPC3, that would be greatly appreciated. And then we'll turn to, perhaps if it's okay to you, Giancarlo, again, because I know that WFP is doing a lot of important work within also the IASC family on early warning systems. And I know there's an IASC early warning, early action report that is produced periodically. So if you can say a word perhaps on how can we overcome a lack of early warning transforming into early action to again avert various crises, but of course in this, because of the topic of this briefing, specifically on famine. So what more needs to be done to ensure that early warnings do translate into early action to ensure that the community is able to act as early as possible to avert IPC4 and IPC5 levels, if I can say so. And then afterwards, I'll turn to Martin. Again, I'm just laying out all the questions in one go so the panelists have the chance to prepare their responses. But Martin, a question to you. Is the World Bank mechanism, the, apologies. So the FAM and others, are they effective in terms of triggering political and financial action? So are these mechanisms effective in terms of triggering political and financial action? And another part of the question is in terms of forecasting. Where are we on anticipating food security as the Paris climate targets are missed and as we hit 1.5, 2, and 3 degrees? So, so maybe we'll kickstart perhaps first with you, Dominique, and then we'll turn to Giancarlo and then Martin. Over to you, please, Dominique.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mervat. And here, perhaps coming on IPC3, but also on the COVID numbers, I think that Martin, in his presentation, made it clear that the vulnerability of people to fall into IPC3 depend on their pre-existing food security situation. And here, what is clear is that we have a situation where COVID-19 has been one additional layer of vulnerability. So it means that people, were already on the verge, were barely able to meet their food consumption needs, being in IPC2. The food, the sort of, the COVID-19 impact and the economic consequences, especially of COVID-19, has pushed millions of people in acute food insecurity. And as a matter of fact, when you look at the global report of this year compared to the global report of last year, conflict always remains over the last 5 years the main driver. But while in the past, the second main driver was climate extremes, This year, it has become economic shocks, and it is clearly related to the COVID impact. And this is true for acute food insecurity, the one that may potentially lead to famine, but also to true for chronic food insecurity, and this is what is going to be coming out in the next edition of the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the world, to which Martin also referred. Now, when it comes to IPC3, I mean, the criteria, I mean, the IPC3 is really when you fall into acute food insecurity, when you have food consumption gaps that are reflected by above usual acute malnutrition, and when you are marginally able to meet your food needs by only depleting essential livelihood assets. This is the moment you start selling your belongings. This is the moment you start cutting on your health cost, on your education cost, and when you even start to sell your livestock and seeds, for example. So this is a clear turning point into an irreversible situation. So this is indeed, I fully agree on the need to advocate for action at IPC3. But what we see today is that for many people, and many, I mean, the big trigger remains a famine declaration. We know that when a famine is declared, it is way too late for too many people. So indeed, we need to collectively advocate, as was said by Jane, for action at time of IPC3 and not later. Thank you, Merla.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Dominique. Super clear. And perhaps with that, if it's okay, Giancarlo, back to you again on the early warning, early action point. Over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. Many thanks, Dominique. I think your explanations are so important for the audience and everybody to better understand, what we are talking about beyond these kind of acronym that are a bit esoteric. Maybe one thing that I would like to come back to the IDP remark I made. I should have mentioned forced displacement because, of course, there is a very high number of IDPs, but unfortunately so, refugees too. So the total forced displacement is extremely high. Was at the end of last year, and if my recollection is correct, I think it's a 10 years highest figure we've seen. So forced displacements and the plight of refugees, of course, in this context is for sure to be considered. Early warning. I think Martin said it. I think we have the tools, and not only in terms of food, I think, food insecurity, to have a good insight of what is coming along, for the next 6 to 12 months. Maybe it is important to remember that with FAO, we started, to ring the alarm now more than 1 year ago on the secondary impact of COVID in a context of many conflict situations, and of course with the aggravating factor of climate change, the famous triple C's threat. So I think the question that, and to me it is an open question, how is it that we know it, okay? We've invested collectively, by the way, the early warning. We have an interagency group. We have very knowledgeable colleagues, even political analysts, even conflict specialists, in addition to the other usual sectors that are pretty good in telling us, what is around the corner, and then the question is, how is it that it is so difficult to act upon that, to really deploy a set of actions that would allow to mitigate, okay, before we enter into a full-blown crisis. I think this is a conversation we should have, and beyond the humanitarian circles, of course, to better understand how we can, you know, with a good early warning system, or decently good, how we can be better with anticipatory action. Thank you.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Giancarlo. And I think this is one of the challenges that we have. Again, to Martin's point, it's not so much only the issue of the analytics and the forecasting and the predictive capabilities within the IASC, but also, of course, with critical actors and partners such as the World Bank. But again, it's how do we tie these analytics and this critical analysis and the forecasting to joined up work and action that can, you know, address some of the challenges that we're facing on the ground. But perhaps with that, and I know one part of the question to you, Martin, is around the forecasting aspect and how it links to the climate crisis. So perhaps over to you, Martin, if you can also elaborate on this question. Over to you, please.
Very good. Thanks very much. And indeed, I mean, to follow up on what Giancarlo was saying. So on the question related to the famine action mechanism and to what extent it's being used actually to kind of mobilize resources, you know, we had a meeting a year ago with the famine action mechanism. Actually, I co-chaired it, and 20 food security hotspots countries were identified at that time. Now, a year later, 11 out of those 20 countries actually have been triggered under the early response financing that was put in place. The early response financing mechanism, you know, has some kind of a methodology to calculate, I mean, the triggers. And once, I mean, those triggers are activated, I mean, those countries qualify for access to the early response financing mechanism that was set in the crisis response window and the IDA 19 that became effective on July 1st, 2020. So that's a pot of money of about $1 billion, of which initially the idea was, okay, $500 million for food security emergencies and $500 million for health emergencies. A total of 13 countries have now have been triggered. So out of the 20 countries that were identified a year ago, we actually missed 2 countries that actually in the end got triggered. Those were not on the initial list of the famine action mechanism. Those are Kenya and Madagascar. But overall, it points in the direction of 2 points, I mean, that Giancarlo was mentioning. So the predictive power that we have and all the tools that we have, you know, is pretty adequate. We are in a good position, I mean, with a high level of probability to predict, you know, I mean, food security crisis. And second, you know, it works to link, I mean, to translate, I mean, the early warning into early action when you have pre-deposition funds available to tap into, which is actually the case with the IDA 19 early response financing mechanism. This is, of course, not the case with the majority of humanitarian aid, I mean, that is being looked for, and you know, efforts to raise that. I mean, once a crisis becomes on the radar screen, a lot of effort and a lot of time is actually lost in raising those resources. Well, in the ERF, there's kind of an automatic trigger. They actually are being calculated, I think, every 2 months or so. Of course, the question is whether the $1 billion in the ERF is sufficient. Maybe, and of course, our board is also kind of looking into that. On climate, you know, I think we all agree that climate, you know, is representing a huge headwind when it comes to kind of resolving food insecurity. So if we are not, if the world is not successful on the climate front, you know, and the question was, I mean, what happens when we go to a 1.5 or 2 degree world? if that happens, we also know that the poor are most vulnerable, to the effects of climate change. And of course, the poor are also most vulnerable to food insecurity. So the picture would not look very good, I think, would actually look very bad, if the world will not be able to contain, or reach, the Paris Agreement targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees. I would be very pessimistic, actually, what would be happening to food insecurity. So for that reason, there is a huge responsibility, actually, to kind of move the needle on the climate agenda, and food systems transition and transformation is an important element of that, as I mentioned earlier in my intervention. A final point, I fully concur with Juan Carlos, observations on food prices. What we see is actually that food prices are close to the heights that we saw in 2007 and 2008, as well as 2011. So kind of close to an all-time height. The World Bank came out with the Global Economic Prospect Report recently, predicting, worldwide 5.6% growth, which is the strongest post-recession recovery that the world has seen in the last 80 years. But if you dig deeper in those numbers, the overall projection for the world is 5.6%. For sub-Saharan Africa, it's only 2.8%. It's kind of half of that. And Middle East and North Africa, it's only 2.4%. Now, of course, so if you combine, those low, economic growth rates, for those regions, and you combine it with the increase in food prices, and we know, that food expenditures make up, a huge chunk of the expenditures of the poor. That doesn't look very good. So I'm with you, Juan Carlos. That the outlook there, might actually make things worse, and we need to get ready for that. It's an area of concern that we're also discussing internally. Back to you. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Martin. Colleagues, I'm aware that we have a little over 10 minutes before we conclude the briefing. So what I'll do is I see already there's a few set of questions that have come through, but I'll perhaps direct these questions to the panelists, and also direct a closing question for each of the panelists to conclude this briefing. So maybe a specific question perhaps for Jane with IGVA, Christian Aid, and also Dominique, if it's possible. I see a question coming from a colleague in Ethiopia, speaking to what we are doing to address the crisis and food shortage in other parts of Ethiopia. So beyond Tigray, what are we doing to address some of the challenges in terms of food shortages in other parts of the country? So if it's okay, Jane and Dominique, perhaps if you can give a shot to the response to this question. Now, and then I'll do a round of a double-sided question, perhaps to all of our panelists, perhaps starting with Giancarlo, and then Martin, and then Jane, and then Dominique. And the two sets of questions to take into account the comments that have come in. One is around linking predictable financing to early action. I see that there's one comment that has come in specifically to the World Bank and WFP on whether it is safe to say that we have not comparatively invested into adequate and predictable financing mechanisms to transform early warning to early action. So I guess perhaps instead of saying yes or no, whether you agree with the statement, perhaps just a response in your closing to advise what more can be done to strengthen predictable financing mechanisms to transform early warning to early action. That'd be great to hear your views on that as part of your closing. And then the second part of the question, I see a couple of comments coming from colleagues around again, building on what Jane mentioned with regards to the need to act as one humanitarian system, IASC and beyond. We need to act, not just advocate, but also in act together in a coordinated fashion around funding, around scale-up responses, around the triple nexus, and so on. So what more needs to be done to make sure that we act in a coordinated way to respond timely, in a timely fashion to when we hit IPC level 3 and not wait until the unfortunate situation that we're in right now with IPC 4 and IPC 5. I know some of the responses came through, especially, you know, from Dominique and from Martin, but if you can elaborate on this as part of your closing, that would be great. So if it's okay, sorry, Dominique and Jane, to put you on the spot with the first question, perhaps to you on Ethiopia, before we move to Giancarlo to deliver his closing remarks addressing the two questions that I flagged. So over to you, please, first, Jane, if it's okay, and then we'll turn to Dominique. Over to you, please, Jane.
I feel that Dominique might want to give a kind of broader assessment of what's happening overall in Ethiopia with plans from UN agencies. But I want to send a question back to the person who has, I'm sorry, I can't see the chat very well, who's posed that question. And I would, if you don't mind, Mervat, it would be good to hear what their answer is. I'd like to know from them what they feel needs to be done outside Tigray in Ethiopia. So if they could write that into the chat, then I think this is an opportunity for them to raise those concerns. But more broadly, I think that obviously ICVA members, including Christian Aid and its broader Family Act Alliance, are working outside Tigray. Of course they are. And that's because, and this is my opportunity to plug something that, you know, I think is obvious to everybody within the Interagency Standing Committee, but, you know, our food insecurity responses and our famine responses are based on the humanitarian principles, which means that we respond where the need is greatest. And we have those anticipatory, we have those forecast tools, we have those anticipation tools, we have, you know, tools that are, as our colleague was saying earlier, that assess food insecurity as it's developed, listening to communities, listening to experts to hear where those needs are greatest. And I'd say, you know, in line with that, it goes back to my point about local and national NGOs and also communities and community-based organizations working, for example, in survivor and community-based response approaches. In Ethiopia, we've seen it in South Sudan, we've seen it in the occupied Palestinian territory as well, to kind of pull that alarm where they're already entering into, as we were saying earlier, IPC 3, so that the whole Interagency Standing Committee and beyond can come together with a series of not just funding tools, but, you know, and advocacy, but looking at technically how we can work together using the cluster system and also using the mechanism set up by local and national NGOs and community-based organizations to respond. So yes, in short, we are responding where the need is greatest in line with humanitarian principles. But I am guessing that you might be triggering an answer from us that says, yes, other areas of Ethiopia also require being assessed and looked at. And that's why I would invite you to put into the chat where you think those areas are. It's our opportunity as well here to listen to local and national NGOs. And, you know, this is a good opportunity for me to again say, you know, what can we do in the coming month if we're not seeing the follow-up to the compact, as we're seeing escalating need, as we're seeing numbers move from IPC 3 to 4 to 5, what can we do as a community to work together through all those different mechanisms and means and tools and funding and so forth to really respond in a quicker fashion, and also to think ahead as we, you know, move to further planting seasons, potentially failed harvest, cyclones, El Nino, El Nina, you know, we know these are on our radar. What can we do to respond earlier? Over.
We can't hear you, Mervat.
Sorry, thank you. Thanks, Jane. So well copied, and as you pointed out, the question back to the colleague in Ethiopia, perhaps to also share his or her advice and feedback on practically, concretely, what needs to be done on the ground to make sure that we're better able as a community to respond to the needs beyond the situation, of course, the alarming situation, responding to the alarming situation in Tigray. Dominique, I don't know if you have any also visual, perhaps that you can share in terms of what's happening in Ethiopia that you can share with us before we move on. But over to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Mervat. Well, I would be happy to share it with the group later on. But I mean, on Ethiopia, clearly, I mean, we are all focused for the moment, rightly so, on the situation in Tigray, but there are needs across, I would say. And as you know, I mean, this is a country that is prone to quite a variety of natural disasters. And for us, when it comes to FAO, over the last year and a half, our top priority has been also to fight the desert locust outbreak. And the desert locust is clearly one additional source of vulnerability we have to deal with. I mean, it's not yet fully over. The situation is much better, but it's not yet fully over. So we remain fully mobilized, and we need to indeed make sure that it is not again coming as an additional layer of vulnerability, even in Afar and neighboring areas. But this said, I think from my perspective, I believe it's also important to remember that Ethiopia is a country where a lot of very good work has been done and is being done over the past. I mean, remember that the PSNP has always been considered as a model there, and where we can certainly build on. I mean, when it comes to indeed collective action, clearly the cluster is the place where dialogue need to take place, where collective action is best assembled. I would like also to mention, in view of the comments that were being made in relation to also a longer term nexus type of approach, to my mind, the UN Food System Summit and the country level dialogues that are taking place overall, not only in Ethiopia, but overall, are also an opportunity to stimulate that sort of dialogue and make sure that we can indeed act on implementing this humanitarian development peace nexus and longer term resilience building DRR type of action. So thank you, Merva.
Thank you, Dominique. So I think with that, and again, and I see a comment from a colleague, I believe Alexander, if I'm not, yes, Alexander. Thanks again for sharing your views, Alexander. I hear you in terms of, again, concerns around UN speak and the need for more action. I think this is clear. And it's clear that a lot more needs to be done. And I think this is the message that colleagues and the panelists are sharing. We welcome, of course, any thoughts, ideas, suggestions, not just from our panelists, but also the participants to this briefing in terms of what more needs to be done. I think the message was very clear at the outset that joined up work is critical by UN, NGOs, development actors, and the wider community, practically on the ground, to make sure that we avert this risk of famine. It is clear that a lot more needs to be done in terms of anticipatory action and preparedness action at the earlier phases of a crisis and responding to early warning signals. And there's more that we can do with development actors, with donors, to make sure that we do better and more to respond early before we hit, these concerning and alarming levels of food insecurity. It's clear that the funding aspect is a critical one, because without funding, we are constrained in terms of our ability to deploy the required scaled up response. And it's also clear a key aspect is around the access issue. So this unhindered access and the critical advocacy that's being done on the ground in the field, but also at the global level, to make sure unfettered humanitarian access, so that we can do more with local actors, with local authorities, to get a visual of the extent to which communities, the food security level, and what more needs to be done to respond to the needs on the ground. But please, colleagues online, also beyond the panelists, I mean, the panelists, of course, are providing a critical perspective and giving a visual in terms of what is being done and what more needs to be done. But the idea behind the IASC briefings is that we have a community, and a rich community at the front lines that can also provide advice and share lessons learned and best practices so that we can do better concretely to address the situation on the ground. So perhaps with that, again, and we have, and I know unfortunately it's already 5 p.m., but just final thoughts from our panelists, maybe starting with Jane, if it's okay. Any final thoughts before we conclude? And again, and I know that you raised the issue about this coordinated, joined up work, doing more together as a system, and UN and NGOs. But any additional points that you'd like to raise, Jane, would be fantastic. And then we'll do the same with the rest of the panels. Go ahead, please.
I think just very practically building on some of the input in the chat, I think it's time that we followed up on our open letter and come up with another appeal that draws on some of the words being put into the chat by these local and national NGOs. I think the more we are driven by the timeliness, but also the content of local and national NGOs, the more we will see that we will see an improvement in the delivery and timeliness and the content of our response. Over.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks for being so brief and to the point. So perhaps Giancarlo, if you'd like to come in.
Thank you, Nervat. Well, I think Alexander's remark is indeed very important, and sorry if I sounded very much UN blah blah, but when I talk about the Interagency Standing Committee, I think we need to remember that the beauty of it is that it goes beyond the UN, okay? Because it integrates INGOs, NGOs, and we are working hard to look into a systematic further inclusion of national responders. It won't be easy, but I think we are really determined doing so, and I hope Nervat, you do agree with that for the many discussions we had within the Interagency Standing Committee. Now the second point is that we are making it too complicated. I fully agree. I wish we could simplify. I think we have set us so many priorities within the humanitarian system that at times we struggle indeed prioritizing, because every group wants, the topic they are defending to be extremely high on the agenda. And it's very difficult to arbitrate if you look at it. If you need to arbitrate between GBV, protection, localization, gender, disabilities, how do you do that? But this brings me to the early warning and the anticipatory action and probably the missed investment. I think it's very important to use the word investment. Not long ago, again, the Secretary General, I'm a fan of the Secretary General, I'm sorry, said that the system is not broken, it's broke. So how do you invest money when you can hardly respond to life-saving basic necessities? And this at times, it's really heartbreaking being a humanitarian. So definitely we don't have enough money for investment. This is true for anticipatory action. This is true for reinforcing supporting capacities of national responders and have a flow of funding going down to them, and it's true for other topics. So I want to believe that we need to engage and to talk about this of, what are the needs, what are the strategic, needs we need to address first, and what is it that then we should prioritize. But it's a very difficult exercise. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Giancarlo. Super clear, and I'm sorry to be rushing with the closing because I know we're over time, but perhaps over to you, Dominique, and then we'll conclude with Martin and conclude the briefing. But please, over to you, please, Dominique.
Yes, thank you, Mervat. Thank you for this very good conversation and for the feedback that were included in the chat. For me, a couple of points. Good quality information is key. It's key for anticipatory action. It's key for advocacy. And it's key for well-targeted quality action on the ground. So this and the IPC is about consensus building among many players. This is a collective responsibility. So each and everyone needs to play the game in the community, contribute, and once we have the analysis, we need to stand for it collectively. 2, action is needed at IPC 3. I mean, no doubt about it. It's way too late when we wait for 4, and not even mentioning IPC 5. And in that respect, and I think this is a segue to what you want to say, I think the involvement and the fact that we now have the World Bank so prominently engaged in this humanitarian crisis is a most welcome move, and we hope it can be amplified with other key resource players playing that game. Thank you, Mervat.
Brilliant, super clear, Dominique, and I think this is the message across the board, which is early action at IPC 3, if not even before that. So that's also a good segue to conclude perhaps with Martin's point. So over to you, Martin, before we conclude.
Yes, thanks very much, Mervat, and thanks everybody for the very excellent comments and suggestions in the chat. Yeah, so I would argue that from where I'm sitting, that the early response financing mechanism is a good step in the right direction of linking early action to a predictable financing. Of course, it became effective less than a year ago, and the demand has been overwhelming. So that's actually a clear signal about, I mean, is this the right magnitude? I mean, of this mechanism that has been put in place. And of course, that's definitely something that our shareholders need to respond to. But clearly, from where I'm sitting is, more resources are needed actually to be consummate, I mean, to the level of the problems that we're facing. At the same time, I think hand in hand, I mean, what can be done, I mean, to prepare countries actually better? And in that respect, I just go back to what I mentioned in my earlier intervention. I mean, this idea, which is actually a condition of access to ERF, is to have those food security preparedness plans in place. And I think this would be a very good opportunity for a whole of aid approach, I mean, early on, because you want to avoid a situation that countries also don't prevent in preventative measures. So, and those food security plans, preparedness plans, I mean, could be a tool to bring money and resources in even before, I mean, we hit, IPCT 3 or 2. So thinking about the scope of ERF and the resources in there, as well as, I mean, putting in place those food security preparedness plans for a whole of aid approach. I mean, that would be my way forward when I'm sitting. Back to you, Mervat, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much again. And that's a really good way to conclude the briefing, Martin. Again, something that is very specific, very concrete around how we can work more jointly together around the early response financing, mechanism, and how do we capitalize on this criteria that you have put in place for ERFs to be requiring food security crisis preparedness plans to be in place. And it's an invitation really to the humanitarian community to do more jointly with the World Bank and with, of course, local actors and local authorities to around that, which is really critical to preparedness and addressing IPC 3 levels and beyond. So colleagues, with that, a really huge thanks first to all of the participants and the candid feedback. That's the beauty, I would say, of these briefings, is we always encourage candid feedback, even if it's difficult feedback. We're in this response together. So we also welcome feedback, suggestions, sharing of ideas, best practices, and lessons learned. So really huge thanks first to the participants, those who were able to join us today online. And really a huge thanks to all of the panelists. Really rich discussion. Great to get to also hear the different perspectives from, of course, Jane representing the NGO voice, if I can say so, Martin, the development voice, and of course, FAO and WFP that are doing some critical work around food insecurity, IPC, and of course, the engagement with SG's high-level task force on famine prevention. Really huge thanks. Thank you so much for today's discussion, and we'll be in touch, inshallah, for the next briefing. I understand there will be a briefing early July, exact dates to be communicated shortly, on gender responsive programming in humanitarian settings. That's the next briefing. Thank you so much again, colleagues. Wishing you a good day and evening wherever you may be. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.